Welcome to Rainbow Records, a show about the stories of queer people who lived through the AIDS crisis in Los Angeles. Stories of resistance, resilience, and a community that refused to be erased. I'm your host, Analisa Venolia. This episode is going to be an explanation of the theories that shaped Rainbow Records and made it into the oral history podcasting project that it is. There's so much to go over, so I'll get right to it. Let's dive right in. The theories at the heart of this project are Foucault's theory of discourse and his theory of counter-discourse. For those who don't know, Foucault was a French philosopher and historian, and he's arguably one of the most important philosophers of the modern age. We're going to start with his theory of discourse. Discourse is the communication and ideas exchanged within a group. Foucault believed that each society controls the discourse, or the communication and ideas exchanged, that occurs within itself as a way to maintain power structures and shape that society's understanding of the truth. And he asserted that there were three ways societies controlled that communication of ideas: through forbidden speech, the division of madness, and the will to truth. Forbidden speech is the idea that an individual doesn't have the right to say whatever they want. Certain things are deemed either illegal to say or socially unacceptable. The division of madness is the distinction between rational speech versus what society deems as insane, with the insane speech being disregarded. And the will to truth is basically institutions stating that something is legitimate and true, thus making it true and legitimate in that society. For example, laws. Our governmental institutions enforce laws that they create or were created in the past, and we operate by treating those laws as legitimate ways for society to exist. Of course, there can be change in opposition, but the point is those laws are viewed as legitimate in society because an institution willed them so. These three ways to determine truth and legitimacy in a society are inherently exclusionary. So Foucault argued that they must be challenged. And we'll get to that later. But first, I want to go over some of the other theories that I drew from for this project. Foucault's theory of discourse shows us how knowledge is produced through power structures in a society. So let's pair it with Habermas's concept of the public sphere. Habermas was a German philosopher, and he came up with the idea of the public sphere, which is a metaphorical space in which public opinion is formed and where discussions of matters of public interest occur, essentially where democracy is, in theory, practiced. Kind of like a town square where everyone can come and debate ideas. His ideal public sphere was strictly intellectual, rational, and homogeneous, quote, refusing the fragmentation of niche audiences and different kinds of culture. And we're already running into some issues here, especially with this ideally homogeneous and culturally uniform space. If the public sphere and discourse reject certain voices, what knowledge and truths are being ignored? Who is denied full citizenship and belonging in a society where they are excluded from participation in the public sphere and the production of knowledge? And how do these theories relate to this queer history project? Those first two questions are rhetorical, but I'll answer the third later. Now, you can't discuss power structures and the dissemination of dominant ideas without talking about hegemony. Gramsci, an Italian philosopher, came up with the concept of hegemony, which is a ruling class's domination of the lower classes and groups through the spread of their ideas, and that ideology becoming common sense and part of everyday practice for those lower classes and groups. Some examples of hegemonic ideas present in American society are capitalism, racism, and patriarchy. Hegemony is the systematic engineering of mass consent to the established order, but it's usually not done on purpose, and it's not directly enforced by the dominant class. Instead, it's enforced by social institutions, like schools. Or, bringing us to our next topic, media. Mass media is a huge way that hegemonic ideals are disseminated to audiences. James Lull, a social scientist and communications theorist, explored how mass media spreads hegemonic ideas and integrates them into commonplace forms of communication in the United States. He argued that counter-hegemonic ideals, basically ideas that push back against existing power structures, are often excluded from popular mainstream media, and that the media outlets that do showcase counter-hegemonic ideals have much smaller followings than mass media. He also argued that when these counter-hegemonic ideals are depicted by mainstream media, they are often presented in a negative light. Think the mainstream media's vilification of pro-Palestine protests, or modified and used to support the dominant ideologies, like the concept of a girl boss. The girl boss concept basically takes feminism and twists it to fit capitalistic purposes, instead of fighting for women's liberation in any meaningful way. Now, back to the media. It's not all doom and gloom. Lull asserted that hegemony isn't all-powerful and that it fails when dominant ideology is weaker than social resistance, which is how change occurs. And Lull identified the queer community as effectively utilizing media to disseminate counter-hegemonic ideas and create resistance. Which brings us to the final theory we'll discuss in this episode, and the theory truly at the heart of Rainbow Records, the theory of counter-discourse. I mentioned it at the beginning, and now we're here. Remember the theory of discourse? That a society controls the ideas exchanged within it as a way to maintain power structures and decide what is legitimate knowledge? Well, just as there are counter-hegemonic ideals, there is counter-discourse. Foucault believed that power mechanisms used by the dominant group in a society could be reversed, and that discourse was the best example of that possibility. Just as discourse could be used to exert power by the dominant group, it could also be turned around and used against that group, creating resistance. And resistance is a form of power. Not all power is domination. Power and resistance can be used to increase freedoms of marginalized groups. As I said earlier, counter-discourse is a way to push back against existing power structures and dominant truths that aren't actually true for everyone. It is, quote, when those usually spoken for and spoken about begin to speak for themselves. And counter-discourse isn't just a theory. It's a practice of marginalized people creating space to speak and share their truths and knowledges. A key part of creating counter-discourse is an awareness in the creator of that discourse that they are not a part of the dominant culture and power structures. Counter-discourse is a way to reaffirm and reclaim ownership of marginalized people's identities and lives for themselves. Basically, counter-discourse creates knowledges and truths that push back against the knowledges and truths produced by dominant power structures in a society. For example, the United States is a capitalist country, and capitalism is the economic power structure presented as the right way to run an economy by the dominant class. Working class people who discuss socialism or anti-capitalist ideas are creating a counter-discourse because those ideas push back against the dominant capitalist ideology in this country. Now, this discussion of theory has been pretty general, and that's because this episode is part 1 of an explanation of the theories behind the Rainbow Records project. So, we'll wrap up this episode here with that explanation of counter-discourse, and make sure you stay tuned for part 2, where everything will come together. I hope that part 1 of the overview of the theories behind Rainbow Records was informative, and that it gets you thinking about power structures and the truth. In part 2, we'll discuss gender, death, oral histories, and how all of these theories come together to shape this project. This has been Rainbow Records. Until next time.